May the peace and the blessings of the Holy Ones pour forth over the world and rest upon us, protecting, purifying, energizing, and strengthening us. There is a peace that passes understanding and a power that makes all things new. May the rhythm of that peace vibrate in our hearts and the creative power resound in our lives, awakening, transmuting, and giving birth to that which ought to be. May our consciousness become ever more at one, our many lights, one light. May the light and the love and the power of the one life pour through all of us throughout the world and attract all good. So be it, and help us to do our part.
Hi, my name is Huri Gadelekian. I am the chair of NGO Committee on the Status of Women. NGO CSW, as we are known, is a coalition of nonprofit organizations globally who fight for gender equality. Our mandate is to really convene these organizations and guests who are really fighting for gender equality once a year during the Commission on the Status of Women. That happens every March, where 193 countries get together and discuss a specific topic on gender equality, on what is missing and what they need to help. We've actually been doing this for over 45 years, and it is really important that we help bring voices of women and girls to the United Nations, where it is heard globally. So for the last 25 years, we've been really working on this document called the Beijing Platform for Action, a meeting that happened 25 years ago in Beijing, and 187 countries came up with the most amazing document that civil society actually brought to their countries and really did amazing work for achieving gender equality. But in the last few years, we've been seeing some pushback. So along with UN Women, France, and Mexico, NGO CSW is committed to now galvanizing, mobilizing voices in order to address what we're calling the Generation Equality Forums. You can actually, there's a website you can check, we'll share with you, and also go to our website, ngocsw.org, to learn more about this campaign. I think it's really important that voices are heard and that we keep fighting against the pushback that we're seeing in so many countries right now. Without civil society, we really can't achieve what countries or governments nationally or even locally promise. So we need to really hold our governments accountable, and we need to help them with implementation of the promises made. So I hope, and I thank you all for inviting me to your meeting, and I hope you will take the time to go to our website and to learn more about us, follow us on social media, and come and join us on all the virtual meetings. Even after cancellation of our forums, we're actually bringing all of our voices to virtual gatherings just like this one. So nothing's going to stop us. Thank you.
Greetings. In my nearly 80 years of life, this is the first time that I am witnessing a moment of collective crises and opportunity. The world is united in facing what started as a public health challenge, but has now become an economic, political, and social justice crisis. In every country, we have discovered unsung heroes. As a retired obstetrician and gynecologist, I am very proud of the heroism of doctors, nurses, and support staff at hospitals. Our eyes have also opened to the other unsung heroes who have never been properly appreciated sanitation, transport, food and delivery workers. So, even from this terrible darkness, there has also been light, love, hope, and heroism. Now in the United States, we are facing another challenge, the persistent discrimination of African Americans, which has reignited the Black Lives Matter movement. Again, from despair, we are finding hope in solidarity and collective action. Because we know that injustice for one is injustice for all. I was born in Iran, in a country and at a time when life was even harder for women than it is today. My devoted and demanding mother wanted to ensure that I would have the freedom and opportunities that she did not have. When I arrived in America as a female surgeon in the 1970s, I was also a minority. I was a Muslim with an unusual name. And whenever I was invited someplace as Dr. Roshan, they were expecting a man, not a woman. I had to struggle to find my way, to avoid the inappropriate behavior of my male colleagues, since we did not have the Me Too movement back then. Even as a doctor, I had to move from one unfair, underpaid job to another until I found the courage to follow my father's advice to be my own boss. And when I was still a young professional, just starting my practice in my 30s, I joined New Jersey Women's Medical Association. Then in 1985, I attended the United Nations Conference on Women in Nairobi, Kenya. That conference was a turning point in my life. I was asked by a Kenyan woman who was the community leader of her village whether I could help her. She wanted me to be her community's connection to the West. I partnered with my friend Sybil Shainwolf, and together we founded the International Health Awareness Network, now called IHAN. There we were two friends, starting something from nothing. At that time, I did not know what we were starting and where the journey would take us. Well, in these 35 years, we have partnered with many NGOs and local communities. Equally important, we made new friends, many of whom are on this call, who have helped, supported, and partnered with IHAN for decades. We stand on the shoulders of our mothers and their generation who had to overcome unimaginable challenges as women. My generation has done our best to make it easier and better for you. But clearly, our work is not done. I pass the torch to all of you.
Good morning. My name is Elizabeth Broderick. I'm the UN Special Rapporteur on Women's Rights across the world. I also hold a number of other roles, including as an adjunct professor at the University of Sydney, as a senior advisor to McKinsey, and as the founder and convener of the Male Champions of Change strategy. It's an absolute delight to be with you today to talk about the global perspective on gender equality. And I know many of us would have been meeting in New York just a couple of months ago to really celebrate 25 years after the Beijing Platform for Action, and also to talk about where to from here. So I'm so sorry that we weren't able to get together in person, but I really applaud you for coming together as a part of a CSW, but in a virtual event. Today I wanted to spend a few minutes talking to you about where we're at on gender equality, particularly globally, and why we need action now. So you will know that the Beijing Platform for Action was a result of the 4th Women's World Conference. So thousands of women came together in Beijing 25 years ago to actually advocate for change. And they lobbied their governments. And 1995, when the Beijing Platform for Action was developed, was actually the high point for women's rights. So what's happened in those last 25 years? We have made progress in some areas. We've made strong progress on maternal mortality. We have more young women in education than ever before. We've had a doubling of a number of elected parliamentarians who are female in the parliaments across the world. And the other thing, and the great shining area, is young women's activism on gender equality, and also cross-movement building with the climate change movement and other movements. So there's been some good progress. But I have to say that there are one thing that became totally visible in the research for the CSW this year, is that we have such a long way to go. And the situation now is that COVID has actually come along, and in many ways it is actually more deeply entrenched the inequality that exists for women and girls. So let me just spend a couple of minutes talking about COVID. I mean, COVID-19 is first and foremost a humanitarian crisis, but it does have differential impacts on men and women. And what we know is that while more men are actually dying from the disease, there are still other gendered impacts. So, for example, if I look at the issue of domestic and family violence, we know from different countries across the world, including our own, that there has been an increase in the incidence of domestic and family violence. That comes about as a result of quarantine strategies, of a result of lockdown, and for so many women across the world where home is not a safe place. If we look at the data coming out of Hubei province, they've had a 300% uplift in domestic violence, similarly in Italy and other nations of the world. So that's been one gendered impact. Another is the unequal care burden, which sits in many countries of the world. In fact, I'd say all countries of the world. It's sitting firmly on women. And when children are out of child's care, when kids are out of school, when we're seeing an increased need to care for our elderly because they are more vulnerable, and indeed when everyone's at home, the burden of unpaid work is increasing. And that burden is falling disproportionately on women across the world. The third thing I say is they're describing this second crisis, the economic crisis that's accompanying COVID, as the she-cession. They're saying never before has a crisis like this impacted so many women economically. And we know that women are disproportionately impacted because some of the sectors that are impacted, such as travel, such as retail, such as hospitality, many of those sectors are feminised industries. So we're seeing more and more women in precarious work or actually dropping out of the labour market entirely. And then finally, one of the other impacts is that in the recovery and rebuilding strategies, we're seeing an absence of women's voices. Pretty much in every national COVID response recovery team across the world, we're seeing a very low number of women actually doing the planning and involved in rebuilding what comes next. But I don't want to leave you with all the challenges. What I do want to say to you is that I'm seeing some incredible opportunities as well. I'm just to give you a couple of examples of that. I'm seeing some really strong advocates, both men and women, and particularly also in the private sector, stepping up and talking and to particularly their employees and their male employees about how care and unpaid work can be better shared in the home. I know of a number of male champions of change who've actually run men's only Zoom calls to share strategies about how they're ensuring that the work that's at home is being shared equally with their partners. The other thing that we've seen is we've seen a wholesale shift from working in an office to working from home. And here I'm talking about knowledge workers. And what we're seeing with that is that a shift that would have taken years and has been taken years in many companies has happened over a weekend. So if you look at Telstra, they moved 25,000 employees from working in an office on the Friday to working from home on the Monday. And as some people have said, you know, it makes you wonder why we couldn't have done that before. The fact is, one of the barriers that we've actually identified, or two barriers, are habit and inertia. So I'm not saying that working from home is going to suit everyone, but where we're at now is hopefully a mindset where we can have greater levels of flexibility, that people can be present in the office when they want to and when they need to be, but also they can work from anywhere else in the world when that works for the employer and also the employee. Of course, often health workers need to be physically present, although of course telemedicine and all those other things have really received a boost. And I think what I've heard from most of the CEOs that I'm dealing with is this is a moment of opportunity. We need to ask ourselves, what type of world will we inhabit post-pandemic? Are we happy to inhabit a world where inequality, and particularly gender inequality, is more entrenched? Or are we going to do something different? And if we decide to do something different, we need to start taking those decisions now. Those decisions which are going to result in a much fairer, a much more equal, and particularly a much more gender equal world. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining me today to discuss the impacts of COVID-19 on women and girls, some of the issues UNICEF remains concerned about as countries start to reopen, and the solutions that women and girls are asking us to take forward, to take to scale with our partners like you. Thanks for your attention and for listening. I'm Lauren Rumble. I head UNICEF's Gender Equality Portfolio, working with teams in over 190 country offices, with over 19,000 staff, interns and consultants, determined to translate gender equality principles into our programs and into our workspaces. Even before COVID-19 struck, we knew that there was a disproportionate amount of care carried by women and girls. Women form the bulk of the health frontline worker service, seldom paid or recognized for their work. Training opportunities are few, and they really suffer from a lack of employee protections such as medical insurance or childcare for their own families, despite their life-saving work. These patterns start early on in childhood, with girls doing double the amount of household chores than their male siblings. This compromises their learning and play opportunities. We know from our data released in March, together with Plan and UN Women, that girls' education starts to become a crisis the minute they hit adolescence. Much more at risk of violence, discrimination and abuse, and child marriage. Girls are failing to complete secondary school and transition successfully to work. Even if they do make it into the workplace, they're more likely to suffer from unequal pay, discrimination, and harassment. Violence is a real problem for women and girls, especially by those closest to him. Before the crisis, we knew that 1 in 3 girls was at risk of violence by a partner, with little access to justice, medical, or psychosocial services. Programs in all 3 areas, tackling social norms, addressing gender-based violence where it starts, and really working with communities to support paid, well-recognized jobs for women, is long underfunded and unrecognized as necessary work by governments and by other sectors. Now, as countries start to reopen and governments design meaningful response and recovery strategies, we must put women and girls at the heart. How can we do that? We have 3 key recommendations. The first is to address this crisis of care and protect the caregiver. That means gender-responsive social protection, like unconditional cash grants, directly into the hands of women and girls. We know that they will make wise choices about how to use that money in their own families to meet basic needs and reinvesting in their local economies, helping to stimulate growth and recovery. We also need to prevent gender-based violence before it even starts. That means addressing harmful norms and working with parents and community leaders to talk about women's rights, girls' rights. We need to make sure that services are accessible for survivors and really centered on their needs. We're working in refugee camps in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Bangladesh, to make sure that survivor-centered services are available in virtual safe spaces for those who can't come in person, as well as in-person clinics and support centers. We're also using technology to create platforms for engagement and discussion with young people. We've just launched a new app in Southeast Asia, which is also going to be launched in Kenya, to really provide information to young women and girls about menstruation, about their own reproductive health, and where they can access more information. Thirdly, we want to see greater investments in opening up schools for the better for girls, especially focused on the most marginalized and disadvantaged. That means addressing the digital divide. We need to connect schools in the most rural and remote communities with the internet so that girls can learn offline and online in the times that suit them best. We need to train teachers and guides on how to identify signs of abuse and where to refer them. We need to tackle those prejudices and bias in our learning materials so that we can really create a new generation of learners and entrepreneurs. And finally, we need to really fund women and girls organizations. They are the front line of services and they know what works best for them. UNICEF has joined civil society and foundational groups to support the first ever Girls Resilience Fund, providing small-time grants to adolescent girls' movements and collectives, helping them get the help and care they need when and where they need it. Girls know best what works for them, and we have to stand back and stand aside to help them have their voices heard. We need to trust in them and make sure that all our response efforts create a new and more empowering future for everybody. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Jordan Williams, Director of Global Policy and Advocacy for the International Health Awareness Network. I would like to thank Dr. Casper for inviting me to share a bit about my experience over the past few years as youth representative to the United Nations and some of the things that I have learned about the role of research and mentorship and charting out a path towards a just and equitable global society. I arrived in New York in 2017 to begin my graduate studies, having just completed a few years' service back home in Texas with the Refugee Resettlement Agency supporting unaccompanied minors seeking humanitarian protection at the border. Within a few weeks of starting classes, I met Dr. IHAN at a conference on migration. I was moved not only by the wisdom shared by the guests IHAN brought to highlight the urgent health needs of this population, but also by their determination to effect change on the ground. I'm grateful to say that long after that meeting, Dr. IHAN brought me on board and set us out to work. For the sake of time, I'd like to highlight just a few of our more recent policy projects and some thoughts on how we, in particular we, the next generation of scholars, mental and physical health care providers, educators, lawyers, business professionals, and everything in between, can actively champion change. During that first year, IHAN was invited to draft a statement for NGO CSW. This statement was synthesized from research and deliberations launched by the Zero Draft team, who'd conducted a thorough review of the literature and agreed language on the topic of that year's Commission on the Status of Women, in order to present a concrete set of recommendations for future action. These recommendations were well received, and in the years going forward, we set a successful formula for analyzing future CSW themes by cross-referencing a number of domains against a number of underserved populations, which you see color-coded below. The preamble from our 2019 statement is also displayed here, calling for increased collaboration in protecting and promoting the human rights of all women and girls in all contexts. Here is an excerpt from a compendium built by Dr. Marciana Popescu, a dear friend of IHAN through Fordham University, and myself, on behalf of the NGO Committee on Migration. This document was grounded in a previously published set of recommendations called the 10 Acts, which outlined a series of objectives for safe, orderly, and regular migration. These were published by civil society, however, member states ultimately incorporated them into the Global Compact on Migration. Drawing from the expertise of colleagues around the world, this compendium contained concrete examples of how civil society had successfully implemented each of the aforementioned objectives, alongside guidelines for bringing these practices up to scale. The final text was welcomed at the adoption of the Global Compacts in Marrakesh, Morocco in 2018. I have also had the honor of serving as vice chair of the Working Group on Girls at the UN. With the devotion of an exceptional team of graduate students and their mentors, this coalition was able to produce an updated set of fact sheets on the human rights of the girl child. As an example, I have displayed a portion of our piece on the rape of the girl child, including relevant statistics, preventative practices, and links to relevant UN and scholarly publications. These fact sheets have become an essential tool for grounding our discussions in evidence when meeting with UN missions or conducting other advocacy initiatives. The full set of resources has been published at girlsrights.org. This past year, in preparation for the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, our NGO CSW team has conducted a thorough review of not only the human rights legislation from 1995, but of all interconnected international agreements, several of which you see listed here. Our methodology for this endeavor was somewhat more straightforward than in previous years, focusing on the 3 M's: mandates, what should have been happening on the ground over the last 25 years, metrics, how are we measuring our progress towards these objectives, and how are we determining compliance, and then missing, what issues have come about in the next 25 years, what things still need to be added to the books, and then again, as always, what actions and best practices can civil society bring forth and recommend. For the sake of time, I will not dive too deeply into our findings, but it is sufficient to say that our generation owes much gratitude to our mothers and grandmothers before us. At least on paper, we as a human family are all in consensus about what our world ought to look like. And while there are certainly still areas of the agreed language that must be strengthened and updated in order to better protect the most marginalized, our generation has the luxury of devoting ourselves to the next steps: action and accountability. One of the benefits of working in coalition, as these examples have shown, is the wealth of knowledge in the room, knowledge in terms of depth, diversity, and lived experience. As our world becomes ever more reliant upon technology, especially under the uncertainty of COVID-19, it is essential that we continue to leverage these tools in ways that allow us to learn from voices that too often go unheard, including but not limited to those of our girls and youth, those of widows, child brides, persons of religious, ethnic, and cultural minorities, survivors of all forms of violence, those living with disability, and those who have been displaced. I will close simply by sharing how excited I am to hear from our students and learn how the knowledge they are generating can inform our practices at both the grassroots and global levels. Thank you so very much.
Everyone, my name is Maria Mensen. I am president and co-founder of Mensen Academy in the Dominican Republic. I have been working and collaborating with the International Health Awareness Network, IHAN, since 2003, while I was a student and a journalist working in New York City.
Today, I am here to share with you some of the work we do to further IHAN's mission of empowering women through education. Mensen Academy was founded in late 2009 in the rural mountains of the central North Coast. It is a collaborative family effort where our main initiative focuses on the quality of education delivered rather than in the quantity of people we serve. Though the program started as an informal English or art session delivered in my kitchen, the program has evolved to include kindergarten and preschool grades all the way to 5th grade, recognized by the Ministry of Education in Dominican Republic. We have enrolled more than 250 children and young adults in our programs since we opened our doors. Around 90% of them are still in the education system, since most of them are still very young, and more than 70% have been girls. Though our rotation rates suffer every year due to economical community aspects and the ever-changing tourism industry, it is easy to see that our impact in the community continues to show growth and permanent positive signs. Some of the girls who started the program with us when they were between the ages of 10 to 14 have continued to further their education and are now proud university graduates. Candidates to receive degrees in the upcoming years in accounting, veterinary medicine, education, physical education, and business administration. Or they have successfully enrolled in the Naval Academy, become recognized national athletes, and have integrated gracefully to the workforce of the nation in the fields of tourism and hospitality. Our younger students are often recognized regionally or even nationally for their excellence in mathematics, literature, or science levels. And one of the most prestigious high schools in the country, Liceo Científico, looks to recruit our students to their center every year. Our programs continue to grow, and with them, we aim to reach equality through education in the near future.
Why gender equality remains elusive. Women constitute half of the world's population. More than half the nations of the world call themselves democracies, but no nation has achieved gender equality. Speaking at the UN Conference on Women in 1995, Gro Brundtland noted, "There isn't a single country in the world, not one, where men and women enjoy equal opportunities." In spite of small progress, this remains true today. Some of the key factors contributing to women's inequality are mortality inequality. Left to nature, there should be more women than men in a population. But some countries report fewer women than men in their population. This is due to the unnaturally high mortality rates of women, which points to practices of severe gender bias. For example, countries where there is strong preference for boys over girls, female feticide and infanticides are still prevalent. Nurture and healthcare. Globally, girls are 3 times more likely to be malnourished than boys. Malnourished girls grow up to become malnourished women. Women's well-being is key to healthy families, indeed healthy societies. Access to education. For a number of reasons, most children not in school are girls. In some places, girls between the ages of 10 and 17 are often forced to marry. This disrupts their education and limits their lifetime opportunities. Special opportunity inequality. Gender bias occurs in specialized areas of higher education and training, such as in science, technology, and engineering. Not uncommon, even in many developed countries. Professional inequality. Gender bias is prevalent in the higher echelons of universities, corporations, government, judiciary, and international bodies. Coupled with that is the entrenched pay gap and the recently identified Me Too issue that points to widespread sexual harassment of women in every rank. Ownership inequality. Property and assets inherited on the basis of patriarchal traditions and laws results in women's chronic economic dependency. Laws also constrain women's ability to secure bank loans and other resources, limiting women's autonomy and entrepreneurship. Inadequate role in public policy decisions. Worldwide, women have very little voice in public policy decision making at the local, national, or international level. Fewer women are in the parliament, the Congress, or in leadership positions as compared to the total population. Nobel laureate Amartya Sen noted, "Nothing, arguably, is as important today as an adequate recognition of political, economic, and social participation and leadership of women. This is indeed a crucial aspect of development as freedom. We must achieve that development by not letting freedom and equality remain elusive." Thank you.
Hear you very clearly, and we're asking you to speak about Bangladesh's experience and women's empowerment and advancement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Casper, and I'm delighted to join this inspiring group of committed and accomplished women. It actually takes me back to the heady days leading up to Beijing. And I'm also very happy to wish Dr. Roshan a very big happy birthday. She has always been an inspiration to many of us. I see the list of speakers, and I do realize that I'm possibly the only amateur here. I'm not a health professional or expert. I will only be able to share with you the experience of my country in taking forward the women's agenda. Dear colleagues, dear friends, 2020 was supposed to be an auspicious year for advancing gender equality. It marks the 25th anniversary of the adoption of Beijing Declaration and the Platform for Action. And the 64th session which was scheduled in March, where many of us were there, was much awaited to celebrate and take stock of Beijing achievements. Unfortunately, CSW ended up being the first casualty of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the session had to be cut short into a mere formality. But I'm glad that we did not accept that setback and do nothing. And here we are. And I think today's event is a right step in that direction to do something. Dear friends, let me share I have a longish statement, but let me share very briefly what the experience of my country. Bangladesh is a relatively young country, yet our achievements in gender equality and women's empowerment has been way better than most of our contemporaries with similar socioeconomic backgrounds. According to the World Economic Forum's Gender Gap Report of 2020, Bangladesh leads in South Asia when it comes to women's advancement and empowerment, ranked 50th among 153 countries and 7th when it comes to political empowerment. And one may ask, how did this come about? And I would say it starts with our constitution. Our constitution clearly stipulates equality of men and women in all spheres. And from the very beginning, Bangladesh has promoted women's equal participation in public life, introduced affirmative actions to integrate women in politics and economic activities. And over the past decade and a half, I would say, there have been transformational changes which have resulted in narrowing the gender gap further in our national life in all spheres. And one of the main factors I would say is that our achievements on women's empowerment is the result of strong political commitment and innovative policy interventions. Bangladesh is perhaps the only country in the world now where we have had elected women prime ministers without a break since 1991. At present, we not only have a women prime minister, but the speaker of the national parliament, the leader of the opposition, and the deputy leader of the parliament are all women. Having women in leadership positions was instrumental in bringing about real change and in adopting bold policies to integrate women's participation in all spheres of national life. And mind you, we are a traditional society and a developing country. And I believe the second other instrumental factor was our heavy investment in women's and girls' education. And I think that opened up new opportunities for them. In fact, participation of girls in the primary education is now higher than boys. Women's participation in workforce has also significantly increased, and we believe that with women's economic empowerment, their status in their families and communities are also improving. They certainly have more say about their lives. There are studies to show, and this might be of some interest to you, that Bangladesh's success in bringing down the high population growth rate was a direct outcome of women's education and women's economic empowerment. We have also found that with education, discriminatory customary and social practices such as early and child marriage could also be significantly brought down. Literate and working women certainly had better bargaining power in family matters and about matters related to her life, from when she will marry to how many children she wants to have. And to strengthen these policy measures, enabling legal measures and laws have also been adopted, although I do admit that challenges remain. Women's empowerment can often be negated by violence against women and girls. Early marriages, domestic violence, etc., certainly stand in the way of the realization of women's full potentials. Efforts are made at every level to raise awareness about such social ills and to ensure the effective application of the laws and policies that are in place. And in this respect, I wish to recognize the important role played by women's organizations, CSOs and NGOs in Bangladesh in protecting and promoting the rights of women. And they play a very important supportive role to the efforts of the government. Now, let me very briefly touch upon the devastating impact of COVID-19 that may have on all our gains made so far. And I know previous speakers have touched on that. Globally, this pandemic has resulted in increasing incidences of violence against women. We have heard about that. And at a societal level, this pandemic has raised the risks for women due to their traditional roles as caregivers. For example, in Bangladesh, the health system is dominated by women. More than 94% of our nurses and over 90% of the community health workers are women. And they are now vulnerable to infections and risks to their lives. And COVID-19 is also seriously impacting on women's livelihood. Over 90% of women in Bangladesh are employed in the informal sector, and many are now losing their jobs with no protection. And same is the plight of the thousands of women migrants workers from Bangladesh who had helped to bring transformational changes to the lives of their families and children, as many have lost their jobs and are facing the prospect of being returned home. Even in the formal sector, massive job losses confront women now. And I will very quickly try to round up this sort of close up there. The closure of schools also, I believe our other speakers have said, referred to this. The closure of schools, colleges, and other educational institutions are also going to impact the achievement made in girls' education in Bangladesh, especially in the rural area. The government has taken a range of initiatives to reduce and mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on women, especially on women-headed households, women-led businesses, small and medium industries to recover from the losses. But it is very clear that we need collective and dedicated efforts to tackle the negative impacts of COVID-19 at the national level, but also to have it very much integrated in the global agenda for gender equality. We must continue to raise our voices about the women's vulnerabilities and special needs during this pandemic and integrate them in the responses. And it's also very important to engage and empower women in tackling the pandemic and its socioeconomic, political, and cultural impacts in all situations. Bangladesh will continue to work on this front, especially in the UN. In April, we joined the UN Secretary General's appeal on gender-based violence and COVID-19. And as one of the delegations, which was always at the forefront when it came to women, I mean, I personally, I was in the Beijing conference. I was involved also in the adoption of the WPS resolution as part of my delegation in the Security Council then. Our commitment to women's empowerment and gender equality is total, and our efforts in this regard will continue until we reach our goal. Again, my apologies for this very longish statement, but it's great to be here, and I wish you all the best, and I look forward to listening to the remaining part of it.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Can you wave if you can? Perfect. Thank you so much for the talks. They were all fantastic. The first question I have is for Ambassador Fatima. So what do you like most about your job?
What do I like most about my job? Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. Coming from a developing country, coming from a country where women were traditionally, it was felt that we have to be at home. But I believe, like Dr. Roshan, I also had very supportive parents who pushed me to, break the frontiers. I like my job because I think it gives me an opportunity to really make a difference. Starting from when I was a young delegate, I remember I was serving here and part of the delegation which went to Beijing. or, when I was negotiating, a part of the, member of the third committee negotiating the optional protocol to CEDAW. So to be able to actually make a difference, I mean, on matters, policy matters, on something that I believe in, but then I can also push it. I think that that's something certainly that inspires me to continue to work in this area. My first assignment was to New York many years back. That's when I first met Dr. Roshan, and here I'm back again. So it's good. I mean, even in this situation, I can give you an example. It was great when we could join the Secretary General's call for against gender violence. And then, for instance, myself and some other ambassadors, we were able to actually have a very good joint statement on the plights of migrants in COVID-19 situation. So yes, we can, in our own humble way, in our own small way, we try to make a difference on policy issues that not only impact on globally, but also can have a much more significant impact at the national level. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. The second question I have is, are there any major life events that have led you to where you are now, or that you can remember?
Could you say that question again?
Yep. So the second question I have is there any specific or major life event that had led you to where you are now as the ambassador?
Sorry, any major?
Life events or a point in your life that had led you to where you are now?
He's really asking you what inspired you. Why would you want to be the ambassador?
I don't know. I'm possibly one of those few. I'm a career diplomat. So I started as a third secretary, as a second secretary, and now I'm possibly come to the fag end of my career. But I don't know. I'm possibly one of those few fortunate ones who was able to, pursue an education, a degree, which was on international relations, but then also end up being able to pursue a profession dealing with that. And to be very honest, I remember the first few days when I entered the Foreign Service, there were only 4 women before me in the entire service. So I had to struggle. But then I would say that, I had very supportive colleagues and especially a very supportive family. And there was no looking back. I think I liked doing what I was doing. And possibly the very fact that, one of my first assignments was to New York. And being able to, again, see that, this small me being able to actually represent my country and be able to make a difference. I don't know. I mean, no looking back for me. I love my job.
Great, thank you. So I've had a couple of questions come through now for Ms. Huri Kudakian. Can you hear me? If you could unmute.
Yes, absolutely. Hi.
Perfect. So this one's from myself. I had, my bags all packed, ready to go for CSW this year, along with 18 other medical students. Of course, we're all terribly disappointed. Do you think that there will be a postponed CW will go ahead later on in the year, or is it more likely to be virtual next year in 2021?
Well, I don't think there's anybody more disappointed than me and the 50 volunteers that worked 6 months to prepare to welcome you all. This has been obviously a huge disappointment for all of us. But just like Professor Gabrielle said and Soros said, we are actually looking at this as a pivotal moment to look at our work and achievement of gender equality from a new lens, right? Because it feels like every time we advance, something pushes us back, and COVID-19 this time is what really is trying to push us back. At the same time, it also has opened up our eyes to say there's got to be different ways of doing things. I don't think CSW 64 is done. I mean, the agreements were already negotiated, and on that first day, that Monday, we all were there for half a day, people who were in New York City, and the Bureau actually accepted the negotiate. It wasn't a negotiated outcome, it was a statement. We are looking forward to CSW 65. We are determined to not only schedule and convene for CSW 65, we are determined to bring Beijing plus 25 in CSW 65. We are not going to forget all that we organized to celebrate, to push for, and to demand agreements that were made 25 years ago. And that was the biggest deal about this past year. It was really to talk to member states and say, you all, your predecessors, agreed on a document. And that's the one thing that UN should really be proud of, that a global convening can happen and governments, all governments in the world can agree on something. And they agreed on the Beijing Platform for Action Points. So we will bring Beijing plus 25. I know a young member of our group actually said Beijing plus 25 plus 1. We might just add a plus 1 to all the logos that we're doing just to make sure that it's there. I do think, I mean, again, it's hard for me to predict from now what's going on next year. We're all in the same boat on that one. We don't know if there's a second wave of COVID. We don't know if it's going to be worse, better, or we don't know if we're going to find vaccine that fast. Without vaccine, I wouldn't expect anybody to convene in such large numbers. I don't recommend it. And I also want to say, especially with climate, this working in place really showed us how, you know, like the carbon footprint that we've been creating is something that we need to look at ourselves, because we are human rights activists and we want equality for all. We really need to think about how we affect globally, especially in climate, when we try to gather all the time. So I'm so pleased that you all are adopting this online possibility of meetings as well, because one of the ways that we will meet for CSW 65 is also virtual. I hope that it's half virtual, half in person. So some people who can afford to fly, or because that's another thing we're concerned about. Economically, I think there's a hardship on all organizations because of COVID and the global economic hardship. But we're also looking at how we can organize possibly not 500, maybe more parallel events, because this past year we had actually scheduled 550 panel discussions. Even when I think about it, I'm like, what were we thinking? I hope that answered your question. I went about it a little bit twisted.
No, it definitely did. Thank you so much. There is one more question I have. So I've seen some online information about UN Women and Generation Equality Forum. Can you tell me what is the Generation Equality Forum, and has all the work relating to this stopped?
Not at all. And thank you so much for asking that, because that's one of the projects that we're most excited about. So NGO CSW is mandated to convene for CSW, as I said in my video. We also do monthly meetings. Our final monthly meeting of the season actually just happened yesterday, and we take the summer off usually. We don't really convene over the summer. And then in September, we hit the ground running, planning for the next CSW, right? But a few years ago, you know, I don't know, I know some people on this, and I recognize some of our, hi Beatrice, hi Elaine, some of our members that come and note that there's always been this need to have a fifth Women's World Conference, right? And it just was not the right time and political will to have one, because as most of you know, as much as we've advanced over the last 25 years, many countries, including unfortunately mine, the United States, has pushed back on gender equality and reproductive rights. So if we tried to have a fifth Women's World Conference, which would be amazing and fantastic for all of us, we were afraid that there were too many governments that were going to take some of our rights back. So instead of trying to keep meeting in that UN umbrella, UN Women decided that they wanted to create a momentum for accelerated progress for gender equality. And that's where Generation Equality Forum idea came about. They partnered with two countries, one global north, one global south, France and Mexico, excuse me. It's been a long week of too much talking. Excuse me. And they launched it, and actually our consultation day was going to be a huge launch at Apollo Theater, where they were going to talk about the steps they're taking forward, and the global meetings that were going to take place in Mexico in May and Paris in July. All of those are postponed right now, and we don't even know if they're going to meet, both in both countries or one of the countries. Everything is up in the air. But what's wonderful about this Generation Equality Forum campaign is what I call is that it's ongoing. And I really urge all of you, especially the younger generation, and that's why we're calling it Generation Equality Forums, because we want the next generation to take on what we have achieved and come up with better creative ways of bringing our rights forward. Jordan Williams actually is on the CSW executive committee, and somebody I look up to as a young intellectual, is a perfect example of how she's taken her education and her life experiences to put into bringing more of equality in our work. So we will be convening consultations online. So most of Generation Equality campaign is online, and you can find more about it. I don't want to take up too much time on a website that I can share here, or I'm sure Professor Gabrielle will share with all of you.
Great, thank you so much for that.
And happy birthday, Saroj!
Happy birthday. So we have some more questions come in. The next is for Liz Broderick. Are you able to unmute and give me a wave?
Yep.
Thank you. So the first question is, are you able to tell us a little bit about the UN Working Group on Women and Girls? And what
thanks very much, Jessica, and thanks Gabrielle and Sarosh and everyone for organising such an interesting event, particularly as part of a CSW. It might be worth just understanding a little bit about the UN Working Group for Women and Girls, because across the UN, as you will all know, there are many different parts. So the UN with a focus on development, security and human rights. Most of the human rights parts of the UN, of course, are based in Geneva, and that's really where I was to be based this year. I'm now stuck down here in Sydney, but in the Geneva part of the UN, which works with the Human Rights Council. So the Human Rights Council is supposed to be sitting this week. It has, interestingly, and you've got to love the UN, just in the last couple of days, cancelled any in-person meeting, and the Human Rights Council will now be sitting electronically, essentially, virtually. You may be aware of the urgent debate that happened yesterday on racism in the US. It's the first time the Human Rights Council has ever held an urgent debate, and particularly at such short notice. And if you're interested, you can follow those links. But just coming back to the human rights part of the UN, there are pretty much three mechanisms for women and girls' rights. One is the CEDAW treaty body, so the treaty body for the Convention on All Forms of Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and Girls. The second mandate is a special rapporteur on violence against women, Dubrovka, who's from Croatia. And the third mandate is our mandate. We're a group of 5 special rapporteurs. We come from each regions of the world, so from the 5 regions of the world. And we form what's called the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls. So we have a mandate to progress all forms of equality for women and girls across the world. And we have a couple of levers that we can pull to achieve that mandate. One is we issue official communications to the heads of nation states. So just to give you an example of that, where we become aware of a human rights violation, and for example, in Saudi Arabia at the minute, those young women human rights defenders who are incarcerated and being tortured despite for their advocacy on, giving women the right to drive, women the right to vote. We're routinely in contact with the head of Saudi Arabia, demanding their release and bringing new information to their attention. And just 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago now, we issued a communication to a South Asian country, because, and it was coming back to the Ambassador Fatma's comments about how many women are employed in the informal economy at the minute. So these women were women who were street vendors. They were selling their clothes in the public space. When the lockdown came, they had to move from the public space, and they decided to become digital entrepreneurs and sell their clothes from their Facebook pages. When they started to do that, and they were modeling their clothes and showing what they looked like, the Prime Minister of that particular nation came out the next day and said, there are young women who are damaging the morality of our nation, and the police will be going over. So the police went over, pulled these women out of their houses, and then they were forced to read Facebook confessions, apologising for modelling their clothes on Facebook, and they're now currently incarcerated. So that's the type of official communication that we issue. We ask the government for explanation. We point out to them that they've signed international conventions, and that at first blush they seem to be in breach of those conventions, and we ask for the immediate release of individuals. And we're doing that with women all across the world every single day. So that's our first thing. The second thing we do is we undertake country visits. So we visit a country for a 2-week period, and we assess the status of women and girls. We do a lot of research on that particular country. We talk, then we go in there and we connect widely with one from the Prime Minister, President, most senior government ministers, to the private sector, all the way through to the human rights activists. And we make preliminary observations in the same way that CSW might, but we make them in country rather than sitting in Geneva. And then we table our reports in the Human Rights Council. And just on early next week, I will table our report into Greece, looking at the status of women and girls in Greece, including in the refugee camps on the Greek islands, in camps like Moria camp, a camp which was built for 1,500, but which now has 20,000 people, and an outbreak of COVID in that camp. So that's the second thing we do. And just the third thing is every year we will do a strong thematic report. And this year we've completed a global report where we consulted in every region of the world on women's rights in the changing world of work. What would work look like if we put women's rights front and centre? And we were interested in that, not just for women, because what we know is when we put women's rights front and centre, everyone lifts. Economies lift, men lift, families lift. So we'll be submitting our report and tabling it in the 44th session of the Human Rights Council just next week. So what my message to you around the UN Working Group is, unlike CSW, you don't have to have exhausted every domestic remedy prior to bringing a complaint to the UN Working Group on Women and Girls. So every night we're getting notifications from all over the world, and I would urge you, as particularly each of you who are engaged in CSO, civil society organisations, to consider the working group as a potential to take the concerns about human rights violations against women and girls happening on the ground. Our working group can take violations directly to the attention of the leaders of those nations and ask for explanations. Now, sometimes that's useful. It's useful for you in your advocacy or not. Sometimes it can be problematic, depending on the timing and the political situation. But I would urge you to just have a look at the website and see exactly the mechanisms that we have that you might be able to access.
Thank you so much for that. I do have another question, if you don't mind. So the COVID-19, the associated economic crisis, the Black Lives Matter movement, and recent events in the US following George Floyd's death have exposed systemic and structural inequalities. Liz, you have always said that not all women start from the same starting point, and inequality will affect those with less power to a much greater extent. How does intersectional discrimination affect women, and what should we do about it?
It's such an important topic because, and we're seeing it, I mean, one thing that COVID has done is it has absolutely exposed the structural inequalities that exist in every one of our nations, because women are as diverse as men, and often the women's movement in our nations has lifted particular groups of women to a much greater extent than others. I mean, those women who have less power will experience inequality to a much greater extent. And I think the Black Lives Matters movement has been really indicative of that. Even if I look back here in Australia, I mean, why is it that 30% of our prison population is Indigenous, when Indigenous people represent 2.5% of our population? And if I look at Indigenous women, we know many of them are incarcerated because of a failure to pay fines, because of the situation that many of them live in poverty. So they're, you know, really, I think when you compound gender with cultural, ethnic background, those things compound to actually increase the barriers to particular types of women. So I just urge each of us, and we're doing it more and more even with the private sector, but we're no longer just talking about women as a homogenous group. We're looking at the most disadvantaged groups of women and saying, well, what are the additional barriers that we should be putting in place? And I'm talking about temporary special measures. So in some of our nations, governments are looking at quotas, at targets, also in the private sector, because if you look at Hispanic and Black women in the US, their ability to enter employment is reduced when compared to white American women. And not only that, they're less likely to be promoted. And during this pandemic, they've got double the unemployment rate of white American women. So I think firstly, it's about learning about that. It's about listening to the stories, but where you've got any influence, it's about using that influence to really call out intersectional inequality, and also to use your influence to really reduce the barriers to women from such a whole diverse area of backgrounds moving forward. And I count in that women with disability. We know the rates of sexual assault are so much higher for women with disability. I'd include that gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual women. And I would include in that, of course, what we call culturally and linguistically diverse women, Indigenous women as well. So, and even socioeconomic poor women. Yeah. Thank you
very much. I do have one more question. So among the medical colleagues, it's obviously still very male dominated, particularly at the most senior levels. What should the medical colleagues be doing to ensure that both young men and women can thrive equally in their careers?
Yeah, it's great. I don't know whether it's the same in other countries, but here in Australia, there's no question that across the medical profession, and particularly in the specialist colleges, there's still colleges that were invented by men for men and are largely run by men when you look at the top. And Gabrielle can speak better than most on that, coming from the College of Surgery. But if we want to build a medical capacity where the best and most talented people can thrive, we need to really remove not just the structural, but I'd say it's about culture. When I look at the colleges and even in the way hospitals run and other medical institutions, often they don't have a culture where men and women can thrive equally. And there I'm talking about the prevalence of bullying. I'm talking about the prevalence of everyday sexism and sexual harassment. What we need to do is to, develop cultures where those things firstly don't exist, but the hallmarks of a culture which is healthy are ones where there's strong psychological safety, where I can speak out if something happens to me without being labelled a troublemaker, where people are vulnerable, they're prepared to say that they don't know what the answer is, they're prepared to talk about things that are messy and sad, and where respect and dignity lie at the heart of a culture. So what does it take to get to that place? First, a part of it, of course, is about strong and leadership. So having leaders who are actually prepared to listen and prepared to be vulnerable. And I think, one of the great examples of that was here in Australia's military. We had some problems with women's treatment in the Australian Defence Force, and it was the senior leaders who were prepared to sit down with women. They sat down with 800 women across the ADF and actually listened to the stories of harm that was happening on their watch and really helping them see what they could, that they needed to do something about this. And there's many stories coming out of that. So I think having leaders who are prepared to listen, stand up strongly, be vulnerable, call out bad culture. And the fact is your culture is set by what you don't accept. So we need to start exiting some of those, even if they're very senior levels, they need to be exited to once again signal to the organisation that we no longer tolerate this type of culture. And I just want to give you one example just from a couple of weeks ago of an individual, a CEO of an organisation who did exactly that. He said that he went to a discussion with some men and women in his team, and one of the gentlemen made a joke loaded with sexual innuendo. Now, what happened then was that all the men laughed, the women laughed, and he said, as a leader of a team, he said, so I laughed as well. And then when he went back to get some feedback from the women, he said to the women, look, how do you think I'm leading on culture and gender equality? They said, you know what, you're really letting us down. He said, but why are you saying that? They said, well, when you were part of that conversation last week, and Steve, the unfunny joker, gave a joke with sexual innuendo, and you laughed. That really let us down. He said, well, wait a tick, I laughed because not only did the men laugh, but the women laughed as well. That's why I laughed. And he said, and the women said to him, well, actually, we laugh because if we don't laugh, we don't fit in. And if we don't fit in, we don't have the opportunity of being promoted in this organisation. But when you laughed, you let us all down. So I think they're the type of micro moments that we need to start calling out. And he said to me, Liz, you know what now? He said, I recognise now that if I'm in a conversation that I wouldn't be happy for my daughter to be in, I stand up and say something right then and right there. And I think it's action in those micro moments that every one of us needs to take, but most importantly, our senior leaders as well. Thanks very much, Jessica.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and it's such an important topic. All of these are important topics, so thank you so much. I now have some questions for Lauren Rumble. Are you able to unmute and give me a wave? Everyone a wave?
Yes, I'm here. Hi, Jessica.
Perfect. Hi, how are you?
Very well.
So the first question I have is, how has COVID-19 helped to spur workplace reforms that better promote gender equality? What changes have you put in place in your own organisation to work more effectively and prioritise gender equality principles?
Thank you so much, Jessica. And this is a topic that's close to my heart as the mother of 2 young sons, because when I first started working for UNICEF with my first baby, we didn't really have a lot of protections in place. We didn't have breastfeeding breaks or breastfeeding facilities. And so I can still remember my husband arriving with my baby for a quick breastfeeding top up and then whizzing away again in between meetings. Since then, a lot has changed in UNICEF. And we're lucky to have signed on to family-friendly policies in March 2019, together with some other UN agencies. What are those? They are specific times dedicated for breastfeeding breaks and facilities in all offices, regardless of the location. It's education grants and child subsidies. It also includes parental leave, and we've shifted from using the language maternity leave and paternity leave to parental leave, so that parents of all genders can take equal leave with their children. And then, of course, it's about flexible work and making sure that our workplaces are free of discrimination, harassment, and violence. So we had already put some of these policies in place pre-COVID, and we were lucky we did that. We introduced flexible work just around mid last year. When COVID struck, we were ready, just like the example that Liz gave, we were ready to quickly reshift our workforce in countries with lockdown to flexible work. And so although different countries are at different places with lockdown measures around the world, those that do are working very effectively. And so now we are able to stay on the ground and deliver, albeit in slightly more creative and virtual ways. The other kind of really positive change, I think, is that there's a greater empathy and understanding amongst staff about the greater burden that female staff are carrying at home to care for sick relatives and elderly relatives, as well as doing household work and homeschooling. But I shouldn't paint too rosy a picture. It's been one of the feedbacks from our female staff doing pulse surveys and kind of real-time check-ins with staff during this COVID-19 period. we've also seen that our female staff, for the most part, are still carrying the brunt of household chores, care work, and schooling. So we really have to try and think harder and more creatively about how to disrupt that in our offices so that we truly are role models.
Thank you. I do have one more question. So as you described in your talk, crisis can bring opportunity. What are some of the opportunities for UNICEF's programming in the next 6 months?
Thanks a lot, Jessica, for that question. I gave you a hint about it in my video, which is about opening up schools. Here we have a really amazing opportunity for governments and civil society to really open up schools better than they were before. So all those restrictions on girls in particular for accessing school, making sure schools are more affordable, that they're opening up safely, that there's, for example, referral procedures in place for girls and boys that are struggling with mental health or other issues, including violence, that we have proper teacher training and preparation for the school opening, that we have both virtual sessions available now as we see that they can work just as well in a rural context as an urban one, that we can do that free of charge. We also have the rollout of something we're calling Girl Giga, which is an innovation to actually power up all schools, particularly remote and rural schools, with internet connection. This is a partnership with Microsoft and several private sector companies. So we're really happy to be using these kinds of innovations that can go to scale really quickly. And then finally, we want to make schools a place where girls can access the services they need, like menstrual health services, like decent school feeding programs. So what that requires is a whole of government effort, not just ministries of education, not just education sector professionals, but really all of us coming together saying we want schools to be better. We want more education for everyone and better quality education. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That's all the questions I have for the moment. I'll pass it back over to Gabrielle.